1989 was a year of many changes for the Turkish government: a new president, a new and threatening regional superpower, and diminishing status in the eyes of the United States government. By 1989, the Soviet regime was reforming to become less socially, politically, and economically conservative, and its control of Eastern Europe began crumbling. The Soviet dictatorship and the threat it posed to Western governments' interests both in Europe and the Middle East was what made the Turkish government so important to NATO as an ally. But now it appeared as though Eastern Europe was the best position for NATO to continue its strategy of containing the now less belligerent Soviet government, and would be in future too. This meant that the Turkish government faced the prospect of being sidelined by the Western world and losing any chance of global political influence. This was made all the more clear to the Turkish government under its new leader, Turgut Özal, when the US government announced that it would dismantle all but one of its bases in Turkey, leaving only Incirlik base in use. And all of this at a time when the Turkish government was having problems with the Iraqi and Syrian regimes. In January 1990, the Turkish government, as part of the construction of the Ataturk dam they were building, blocked the flow of the Euphrates River, which was extremely important to both Iraq and Syria. They blocked it for a month so they could fill up a reservoir. Saddam Hussein suddenly began touting his long-range missiles, his chemical weapons, and rumours abounded of an Iraqi supercannon. It was obvious to the Turkish government that this was a thinly veiled threat, and made them more concerned for the future. The Iraqi, Syrian, and Turkish leaders all tried to come to some sort of agreement about the Euphrates, but things went nowhere. The Iraqi and Syrian regimes argued that the river was an international waterway, and so the Turkish should agree to a political treaty to share it. The Turkish government argued that the Euphrates was Turkish, and therefore they didn't have to share it. Also, they felt that because they owned the water, they had the right to give it to the Iraqi and Syrian governments as they saw fit, but that they would only get what the Turkish government didn't need. Some Turkish politicians began saying, "They have oil, we have water. Let them drink their oil." But that was quite a dangerous position to be taking. Both the Iraqi and Syrian militaries had been built up over years of warfare during the 1980s. Saddam's regime was most worrying for a number of reasons. For one thing, he had a lot of chemical weapons and had proven that he was very willing to use them against his enemies. In April 1990, he even threatened to burn Israel with his poison gas, which wasn't exactly comforting. Saddam's dictatorship was also the most worrying because of his efforts to get a nuclear bomb. Özal's government knew that Saddam had enriched uranium, but they didn't know how close exactly they were to getting a bomb. But if Saddam was willing to use poison gas, he was probably willing to use a nuclear bomb. Saddam's regime was also a big threat because Turkish military war games against a potential Iraqi military invasion were pretty dire. They were confident that they could hold a defensive line against the Iraqi military, but only after Saddam's experienced and well-equipped forces had severely weakened the Turkish military. Perhaps most worrying for Özal was that Saddam had two main motives to attack Turkey if he wanted. The first was the situation with the Euphrates, and the second was debt. In part 2, I mentioned that the Iraqi government bought goods from the Turkish government using credit during the Iran-Iraq war, and the debt they owed from that equaled over $2 billion by 1990. Özal also knew that Saddam could exert a lot of power over the Turkish government without using military force. Saddam could weaponize his economy against them. Nearly 2/3 of Turkish oil came from Iraq, and the pipeline between Iraq and Turkey earned to the Turkish government $300 million per year. Also, billions of dollars of Turkish goods were sold in Iraq. So, if Saddam wanted to, he could essentially cut a huge amount of money from the Turkish economy, essentially overnight, in order to get his way. He could also weaponize refugees. Near to the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam launched a genocide against the Kurdish in northern Iraq. This led to as many as 100,000 refugees fleeing to Turkey. The Turkish government, horribly, saw these people as a threat to them, because it might embolden the Kurdish population to rise up against the government for their own nation. If he wanted, Saddam could potentially carry out another wave of genocide against the Kurds and send even more refugees into Turkey to politically destabilize it and force the hostage Turkish government to do what he wanted. And all this at a time when it appeared the US government would be less likely to intervene to help the Turkish government because of the winding down of Cold War tensions. Then, Saddam invaded Kuwait.